Hello, I'm Dominic Hobson, co-founder of Future of Finance. My guest today is Philip Treleaven, Professor and Director of the UK Financial Computing Centre at University College London. Our subject is a development which could be as exciting as the internet itself, the Datanet. Hello, Philip.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this, which I agree with you could be a mega impact.
So tell us what is a Datanet?
Well, let me, a number of people have recognized that what we need is a way to do information management across the internet. And there are lots of sort of parallel initiatives going on. If you can think digital marketplaces for law and insurance. There are people setting up data stores to keep your data safe. There are companies implementing information management systems. If you take, for example, a bank to manage all its legal documents. There's pressure on government to get the regulators to collaborate both at a national level and also at an international level. It's all about information management. Now, many people have thought that the only thing they need to get right is what we call universal object identifiers. And this is something we almost take for granted. Telephone numbers, barcodes, social security numbers, all of these are universal object identifiers. And for a number of years, Bob Kahn, who's the co-inventor of the internet, has been working on what he calls digital object identifiers. And these really are just an extension, I probably shouldn't dismiss it, but they're an extension of the sort of internet addressing, the URLs, Uniform Resource Locators, and IP addresses, which are also universal identifiers. And the idea is that these digital object identifiers are a uniform way of uniquely identifying a document, finding out where it is, allowing people to access it, share it, etc. But documents and, web pages are just one thing. If you think about it, people are an object, collaborations, companies, and then you've got initiatives like the Industry 4.0, where you're trying to manage production from design right through to producing it on a particular machine to marketing it. It's all information management. And so what we're talking about now, probably the pivotal technology, are these unique object identifiers, where an object can be a document, a design, a person, a collaboration, a company, etc. What the Datanet, however, requires is a whole raft of technologies to actually manage this. And if I can just look away for a moment, I'll try and share a diagram. There are a number of different companies setting up digital marketplaces, even governments. There's a scramble to create digital marketplaces for law, legal services and insurance, two candidates. There's other standard organizations that are looking to standardize digital object identifiers or unique object identifiers. There are governments, particularly in financial regulation, trying to collaborate on things like AML and KYC. There's all sorts of data access organizations being set up, and there are sort of parallel initiatives all going in the same direction. And often they just use a single technology like these unique object identifiers. Now, what we will argue, what I argue, is that the Datanet is actually a sort of technology stack. So at the bottom level, you've got some sort of thing like a distributed ledger or a distributed database. Next, you've got, and maybe the best way to think about this is if you were holding all the data, for example, about insurance. So at the bottom, you've got an insurance database with lots of information. Next, you've got a common data model that allows people to collaborate using this data and targeted on, let's say, on insurance. Then on top of this, your unique object identifiers, where you can identify every policy, every company, every person an organization that's being insured. And then you've got a really interesting technology called federated learning. Now, federated learning has been developed by Google for actually allowing machine learning models to be trained across distributed data sets while keeping the data private. And they've used it to actually train their algorithms on keystroke predictions across millions of Android phones. Now, what we're realizing is that because of the increasing importance of data privacy, something like federated learning is actually a big deal. It's a big deal in sort of three areas. It's a big deal for things like Internet of Things, where you've got lots of primitive devices that need to communicate, but you don't want them to give up their raw data. You've got big organizations that need to collaborate, for example, a big retailer, an FMCG company, maybe a bank. Again, they've got very valuable data that they want to be able to contribute without actually giving people access to raw data like loyalty cards. And the final one is increasingly companies are wanting to actually monetize their very valuable data, but again, not make the raw data available. It could be credit card data, loyalty cards, etc. And therefore, data privacy is important, but collaboration is also important. And federated learning, I sometimes describe as actually taking the algorithms to the data rather than trying to pull all the data into the cloud to process it. So I think this is going to be a really important technology. Moving up the stack, if you want to automate commerce, you need to actually automate your regulations, your legal contracts, and even laws. So, for example, with regulations, you can test whether you're compliant in a particular jurisdiction. Contracts can actually automate things like trade to automatically pay people when bits of the contract are fulfilled. And then finally, people are wanting to be able to interrogate laws to see whether they're actually legal in a particular area. So you can give you a simple example. At the moment, you've got all this hoo-ha about customs and trading between the UK and the EU. Probably the ideal situation is to try and automate the customs legislation so that people can, you can actually do it in an automatic way. So what we've got here is this technology stack, and people are actually developing these things independently for lots of different applications. Like I said, digital marketplaces, government departments collaborating, and Internet of Things infrastructures, and also Industry 4.0. What we're arguing is that there's a lot of advantage of doing this at the present time, but ultimately these things will actually coalesce into what I'm calling a datanet, to indicate its analogy, obviously, with the internet, and it will sit on top of the internet and allow information to be managed. Now, what we've got is we've got an Innovate UK project, which is funded to produce a platform that essentially implements all this data net technology, although the executable contracts is still under development. But it is using federated learning, it's using universal identifiers, it's using things like distributed ledgers. And what we're doing now is we're working with government departments and also companies to actually trial different applications to actually demonstrate the technology and get it going. So I'll stop sharing there and hand back to Dominic to ask me any questions or ask me any points you'd like me to clarify.
Well, thanks for it. There was a lot in what you said there, and I'd like to pick up several points, and perhaps we could deal with them in turn. You mentioned, for example, standard digital object identifiers. Are you describing a world in which we don't actually need data standards anymore because we've got an alternative? You know, a lot of exchanges of data hinge upon people standardizing the formats in which they exchange that data. Does this technology overcome that problem?
No, I think it's there's a lot of advantage for whether it's a company or a government, say, implementing a digital marketplace for legal services or insurance to get their own standard. And the benefit also, it helps us understand what we're doing. But one of the ways, for example, is you might have an XML or a JSON encoding of the data. And then the thing that identifies the standard, excuse me, is the tags that actually are specific for that particular application. And it isn't like you're backing yourself into a corner. If you've got a data standard, let's say for insurance, you can actually build or expand it and include it in a sort of more global structure, which we think will happen when things start to coalesce.
Perhaps I can rephrase that question then, because having listened to your answer, which is the problem with standards is there's a lot of them and people have problems adopting them. You might have a great standard, but actually getting people to use it has proved quite difficult. Does it overcome that problem? Does it increase the rate of adoption?
Yes, I think it's sort of work in progress, and I'm sure if you went back to barcodes and telephone numbers and things like that, you'd have had a situation where there were lots of different competing, in quote, standards, and then they coalesce. I'm a great exponent of bottom-up research so that you understand what you're doing, and obviously the marketplace will actually dictate the different standards, but you can imagine a standard for law, you can imagine a standard for regulation, for insurance, for audit and things like this. And there's and some of them will be successful. And then all you need is a translation mechanism or a mapping mechanism, let's say based on universal object identifiers, which will actually allow these things to be knitted together. So you can imagine a time when a government might have its government organization, or let's take an offshore financial center. You might have the government registration for companies, the way that the financial companies actually trade, are monitored by the government for regulation, the way they do tax, the way they do audit. You can imagine that all knitted together in some automated system in the future.
Can I give you an example from the securities industry where we have two, if not three standards, ISO 20022, ISO 15022, and the old 775 standard. And at the moment, banks are having to translate between these standards, map them and translate them exactly the way you've described on behalf of their clients. Are you describing a system which would enable them to fully automate that process?
Yes. If you think of the internet, and particularly if you're old enough, you'll remember before the internet, when there were lots of competing communication standards. And what the internet did was it put a common architecture on top of it. And now everybody considers the internet, it's fully embedded in society, companies, etc. All I'm saying is that we expect something on top of that for managing information, which I'm, what is it, the right word, colloquially calling a datanet, for actually making this. And just as the internet has protocols for translating between different communication systems, there'll be translation systems for the different data structures, addressing mechanisms, etc.
And what about APIs? Where does this technology fit with APIs? So APIs have come to huge prominence in recent years as a way of exchanging data efficiently between different systems. Can they contribute to that, automating that as well?
Yes, you can imagine if you're building APIs or apps are probably an even better example for a particular sector like legal services or regulation, then they will be focused just on the particular thing that they're doing. For example, regulation's a good example. And what you'll get then in the future is a modification of these APIs and also apps so that they can actually collaborate. And the obvious one would be audit, taxation, automating customs, these sorts of things.
Well, let me give you an example, another example of something we follow quite closely at Future of Finance, which is open banking, open data, where you as a consumer can agree to share, instruct your bank to share data with some third-party provider of an app which you want to use. And we feel this is probably the way the world is going to evolve, that you're going to get a kind of consumer sovereignty through the ownership of their data. And that has huge implications for the way that business is going to operate. Indeed, the whole future of capitalism may be changed by this. And what you're describing strikes me as facilitating that, making it easier. You know, the progress on open data, open banking has been very patchy, particularly here in the UK, but also in Australia and Canada as well, where they have initiatives going on. Do you think the Datanet can accelerate progress in open banking, open data?
Yes, I think that you made the point, very, very well, that it's work in progress, and these things often take a while to actually kick in. But if you think about open banking, you're going to have things like open audit, open finance, open insurance, etc., and they'll probably be developed independently. But there will then be pressure once people understand what they're doing to actually knit them together. So there's a lot of argument for actually now expanding on open banking to do open finance, an umbrella situation. I don't think anybody would say it'll never happen. And there's a lot of advantage, for example, for a country like the UK or Singapore to actually push ahead with things like this to make it easier for companies to do business. And therefore, I think we both agree that it's going to happen. It's just how quickly and whether a particular country or maybe even a company can actually get first mover advantage, by implementing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to get open energy and open broadband and open insurance, as you say, as well. But you've just mentioned first mover advantage. Is this, I mean, the great thing about the internet is a universalizable technology. It's open to everybody. Is open data potentially open to being captured by a particular jurisdiction or not?
I don't think it's open data. I think there are a number of
Datanet, I meant.
Yeah, there's a number. It's a good point. I'd just like to answer this specific point. There's a number of organizations saying, "Give us your data and we'll protect it for you." Okay, I think it's for the fairies, quite honestly. I think that something like federated learning, where people can collaborate and provide access to their data while keeping the raw data secure or private, excuse me, is the way to go. But what we're seeing now, almost on a daily basis, is if you just take retail, for example, the online retailers have caused havoc for the traditional retailers. You have to, and we've seen, for example, in share trading, and I often relate the story. We built one of the first algorithmic trading platforms in Europe, and I remember stockbrokers, almost saying to me, "You're an academic idiot," when I said about people trading shares on the internet. And they said, it'll never happen. People want to come and have lunch with somebody like me and get the benefit of my, 25 years experience. I didn't say, see you in hell, but I think that, we've seen the digitization, particularly of the service sector. And I think, for example, insurance is huge in the UK. The Chinese companies like Ping An, supported by Alibaba and Tencent, have basically automated insurance. And therefore, the opportunity for, let's say, Singapore or, even an offshore financial center to actually provide a digital insurance marketplace like Amazon is you might say frightening or an opportunity, but it'd be good if we did it rather than just let the market sort it out.
Mm-hmm. Could I pick you up on something else? It's a very interesting observation about the sort of Amazon for insurance. But could I pick up something else you said? You said a minute ago that the idea that they're going to be what I'd call data repository service providers. In other words, we say to people, well, here's all my personal data from my birth certificate and my passport through to my banking information. Could you please look after it? And you will provide a service in which I say, show this bit of this data to that organization, this part of my data to that organization, which I've always felt is maybe the way forward here. You've just said that's for the fairies.
Yes.
Why do you say that? To tell us, you mentioned federated learning.
People are very precious about their data, and therefore they won't want to actually give it to third parties. What you will do is that, and this probably already happens to some extent, with things like insurance and government and that, is that they've got your data, and companies can actually not access the raw data, but they can confirm, for example, whether you've got car insurance or whether you've had a no claims bonus, say, for 10 years or something like this. So in many ways it's happening. And therefore, and I think what will probably drive it is things like companies will increasingly want to actually monetize their data without actually giving away raw data. And if for example, take Transport for London, it's, I don't know whether it's bankrupt or short of money, but they need to generate revenue, but they've got absolutely a goldmine of data that they could actually commercialize. They won't want it, they won't or not allowed, for data protection to give away the raw data, but they could actually provide that, what do they call it, DAS, data as a service, and charge companies for the information.
But if people are not taking ownership of their data, the data continues to be possessed, if you like, by the organizations which possess it already. And so you as a consumer can't decide who sees it, but it remains fragmented across lots of different organizations. It's not the same thing as consumer sovereignty of data, is it?
You're assuming that people will give access to the data without my permission. You can still, I think there's a difference. This analogy is maybe stupid, but for example, the banks look after my money. I still have control over how it's spent to some degree. Yes, and therefore, if you don't want an organization, for example, let's say you shop at Tesco's, you've got one of their loyalty cards, their club cards, you might still actually refuse to allow Tesco's to actually monetize it even in an anonymous way. So I think the difference is you've got your data scattered across your bank, your supermarket, your insurance company, and all of these others. Do you pull it into a single depository? And I'm saying no, you don't. It doesn't take away your right to say who has access to it, or the law covering it as well. It's just that I don't think that these data banks, or whatever they want to call it, are likely to succeed as against federated learning, which I think is more socially acceptable.
Right. So you would own it in the sense that you would have the right to decide who sees your data with your bank or with Tesco or with Her Majesty's government.
Yes.
Okay, is that the virtual level? Now that which brings me to something else you raised, which is the whole question of privacy. And do you think what we've just talked about, that you decide who gets to see the data with a particular organization, is the answer? Does that guarantee privacy to people?
Yes, I think it's. I guess there may even be radical changes in the law to, to protect privacy, and in some ways GDPR doesn't work very well. People, you keep bumping into it that people are saying, oh, I can't give you this information, even though most people in society would say yes, the information should be made available, even to the security services or something. But I think things like there's two things. One is the big issue isn't federated learning, but it's universal object identifiers, so that more and more things can be integrated. So that we'll move to a system where tax could be done almost in real time and things like and things like this. And obviously on the back of that, then you've got these other technologies that are working in tandem with the universal object identifiers, and we probably need to think through what laws we need to say how they work.
You've mentioned federated learning a number of times, and I think I know what you mean, but just give us a clear explanation of what that means.
Yes, traditionally, particularly where you've got machine learning algorithms, you would suck everybody's raw data that were collaborating into the cloud, and then you'd have a single machine learning algorithm that would trawl through these different data sets and train itself. The problem with that is that organizations and individuals don't want to give up their raw data or are not allowed to do it, and it's potentially quite dangerous, etc. And that, so what you do is you turn it on its head. What you do is you take, you've got lots of distributed data sets. The easiest one to think of is maybe 3 big companies collaborating, it may be on the coronavirus at the moment. And what you do is you get an algorithm to train on individually those different data sets in a separate way. And then you actually take the trained or anonymous analyzed data to a single algorithm that adjusts itself, and then it distributes the final algorithm to everybody. And therefore you've actually preserved the privacy of the data. So that's why I'm using the analogy, not taking the data to the algorithm, but taking the algorithms to the data. Did that make sense?
That does make sense, yes. In fact, I was thinking as you were speaking that it's a way of constructing one of our favorite things at Future of Finance, which is digital IDs.
Yes.
Am I right to think that?
Yes. Digital IDs, absolutely. They're uniform, universal object identifiers, unique. They can be allocated in a distributed way. You can resolve them. Mm-hmm. And the key thing, it isn't just humans, it isn't just documents and web pages, it isn't just machines. It's, the whole, what we want is a single addressing mechanism that does the whole lot, because we're even moving to situations where you've got you've got algorithms operating like artificial people, so you can see the way things are going, so that any object can have its own identifier and it can be resolved of where it is.
I think the beauty of what you're describing for digital IDs is that I don't have to say to somebody, a company, please manufacture a digital ID and here's your right to access my data to manufacture it for me. This becomes a much more seamless, distributed, as you say, federated process where it's assembled from lots of different components in lots of different databases, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And going back to the internet, if you saw how it evolved, it just became universally easy to use and everybody was using it. And as I say, the rest is history. And the argument now is we now need to do the same thing for information management.
Now, this makes me think, what are the implications of this? You've mentioned Google, being the pioneers of federated learning, but what are the implications of this for the FANGs, for the Amazons, for the Microsofts, for the Facebooks, and for the Googles of the world? These are organizations whose revenue model depends to some extent upon monetizing or reselling our attention to third parties who advertise to us. Is this technology going to be good news for their business model, or is it going to empower a whole new class of organizations whose revenue model doesn't rest upon reselling our attention to third parties?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and one I have to say that, I've now thought about for about a nanosecond. My assumption is that it could be a democratization of information management, so you haven't got a few big companies monopolizing it. I don't know whether the analogy with, fintech and such like, but my assumption is that rather than Google taking advantage of your data, more and more people will be able to participate. So, for example, if you have a supermarket that that wishes to actually monetize your loyalty card data, or and also your the transactions you make without saying who it is, it might be the case that they need to actually recompense you for you participating in that. Otherwise, you block it. And you can see the way, for example, that YouTube has grown by hosting people's videos, but then the people, the influencers and people like that are, if you've got a lot of followers and people looking at your videos, they do pay you at least something for it.
Mm-hmm. So we can look forward to a world in which actually the benefit for the consumer is that their data has a market value, which the people who wish to make use of it to sell to third parties will actually pay you for it.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable thing to assume. Otherwise, consumers will just block access, and the governments will actually implement laws to give them the right. Well, you can see this is on the cards already, to have control over their data.
Mm-hmm. Just one final question, Philip. Just you touched on this earlier, but where has this technology actually got to? Who's working on it, and when can we look forward to some concrete applications of it?
There's lots of, you can split it into two parts. Firstly, there are a number of organizations, companies, governments, NGOs, etc., that are pursuing specific applications. And that might be digital marketplaces, Internet of Things infrastructure, Industry 4.0, collaboration of government departments, or automation of government departments. So they're all beavering ahead, and that's to be encouraged. Then there are people working on things like digital object identifiers and looking at standards for that. And there's a competition between, Bob Kahn's set up this DOI organization. It works very well. It's a not-for-profit, and that the European Commission are trying to develop their own addressing structure. And it isn't, one of them is going to win, because you can map one to the other. And therefore, and what my contribution, or our contribution, is we have this Innovate UK funded platform called AIR, which tries to pull lots of things together. And we're trying to prove this, or pull all the technologies together, and try and implement various different applications, to demonstrate it, whether it's regulation or digital marketplaces. So there are lots of things that actually work, like the digital object identifiers. There's the IoT infrastructure standards, there's the Industry 4.0, and it isn't a case that they're going to be made redundant. They will just go forward until they coalesce. So there's a lot going on. It isn't pie in the sky. I think my only contribution is to say, if you think where it's going to go, it's probably going to coalesce into what I'm calling a data net at some stage, with various different mapping functions between the different systems. But the best way to move forward is to actually pursue all these initiatives independently, and then once they are all proved, pull together. But I guess that a lot of these will come together in the next, not 15 years, but probably the next 2 or 3 years.
Now, I must ask you this again. You've touched on it already, but this technology strikes me as potentially very powerful, potentially transformative, in much the same way that the internet was powerful and transformative. And as we know, the internet emerged from work in the Department of Defense. It emerged from national security considerations, if you like. Now, we've talked a little bit about first mover advantage. The internet eventually became available to everybody, but that didn't happen entirely by accident. Measures had to be taken to ensure that it didn't become a closed garden, to use the phrase which we often hear in the technology industry. Is there a danger here that this technology gets captured, or is it useless if it's captured by one interest?
I think if you look at the internet's very interesting, because what you're seeing now is what they call splinternet. There's a Chinese internet, there's a Western internet, there's a Russian internet. And so, yes, I think given, all the cyber attacks and things like that, it is quite likely that what we're calling the Datanet might also splinter into different groups, because people obviously see, or governments will obviously see competitive advantage, and there's a huge amount of economic competition at the moment, even between governments for different digital marketplaces. So I think it's, the analogy that you've alluded to, of it splintering is, is quite likely. Yes, I think one has to admit that.
Mm-hmm. And is it too soon to say which interest, that's the word I'll use, is ahead in this technology and who's behind?
Yes. I'm very impressed with the amount of innovation going on in Asia. The Asians have a model that I often refer to as state capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
in that all the resources are focused on economic development. And I think that countries like particularly Korea, Singapore, etc., are moving very rapidly. And what we need to do, particularly if we just look at it as a single country, is that we also need to innovate in the same speed. Otherwise, the innovations will all happen in Asia, and particularly in things like the service sector. Everything's up for grabs. Having said this, the positive sign in the UK at the moment is there's a huge amount of innovation going on. People doing startups, the unbelievable number of people, students, that are changing the way universities do impactful research. They're all trying to commercialize what they're doing. Lots of professionals are now thinking, to do a what I call a hobby startup, and that. So lots of positive signs, but at the moment, whether you call it an economic war or whatever, but there's certainly a scramble to innovate at the moment, and and Asia is definitely setting the pace.
So if there was one thing you could name which would accelerate the progress in developing this technology in the United Kingdom or the United States, what would it be?
Obviously, my belief is that just as the American government, although we're talking about the military, push the internet and open source it. If the British government chose to adopt something like the Datanet, or the concept, etc., there could be great economic advantage for us. Having said that, a single offshore financial center could also get great economic advantage by integrating all its government and financial services together. But the key thing is not to write policy papers, but to actually do it. We have a lot of interaction with the Singapore government now, and it's very interesting. The difference is you could say they don't write policy papers, they just drive change. They drive implementation. And the problem in the UK is there's a tendency to think that all we need to do is write a policy paper on it rather than to actually implement it. And I think even the head of the CBI was saying, the proof of the pudding is actually in doing it rather than, discussing it. But lots of positive signs, huge amounts of innovation going on in the UK, and the government is clearly taking a bigger role in change. They just need to choose some groundbreaking, things, and I would offer them my Datanet concept as one thing that could actually be a sea change in the UK.
Actually do it. We might well adopt that as our new motto at Future of Finance. Philip Treleaven, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you for inviting me.